You've probably heard China's biography several times this week, so I'm going to be brief and start us off with a couple of kind of opening, I guess, salvos. China Miéville is the author of 9 novels, unless that's changed this week. 3 novellas, 3 short story collections, comic books, a Marxist analysis of international law, and essays. He is a 3-time recipient of the Arthur C. Clarke Award and has received the British Fantasy Award twice and the Hugo Award once. Hope I got that right. Please correct me if I missed. In the last 2 decades, he has created an expansive body of narrative fiction dedicated to both an ethics of engaged skepticism and an aesthetics of the impossible. He crafts literary works that challenge language to enlarge itself, to address new realities and possibilities, to change language, not at the glacial pace that sociolinguists examine, but at the dizzying speed of what is urgent and essential right now. Incredibly, he's accomplished all of this through speculative fiction within the world construction of science fiction and fantasy, counterfactuals, monster tales, among many other forms. Now I want to give one more thought, I guess, on the way toward the conversation. China has written unforgettably about states of paralysis generated through fascination. You might think of the magnificent slake moths in Perdido Street Station or the narcotic speech in Embassy Town. Yet in his work, fantasy, the fantastic, and fascination produce the very opposite of distraction, let alone paralysis. These are works of utterly energizing estrangement, and we're very fortunate to have him with us today.
There's a light on it. Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, so let's get started. China, given the extraordinary range of empathy and perspectives in your novels, the first question I want to ask is, are you a covert remade? That was a question generated sort of mostly organized to test the knowledge of the audience of China's first series of novels. The real question is whether or not you'd be willing to talk a little bit about the human-animal hybrids of the Baslag trilogy, of mixture as a kind of metaphor and motif, as a kind of governing practice, of turning genre into experimentalism. Really, this is about, the question is about the ways in the sort of generative imagination that your novels have taken what certainly I thought of as a genre that was recognizable and just spun it off into, sort of extraordinary realms. So I wonder if you'd sort of maybe start with just the idea of the remades and...
Yeah, well, I don't know who here has read what, if anything, so I don't know how many people here know what a remade is, but I mean, essentially, in the first, not in the second through fourth books, which are all set in the same world, there's a group of people who are criminalized by the state, and their bodies are literally remade with the addition of, sort of magical addition of animal parts and machine parts and so on to create these kind of monstrous hybrid bodies. I mean, in the narrow sense of the sort of etiology of the remade, specifically in that book, it was 2 immediate impulses. One was, as someone who has always loved monsters and hybrid bodies, I wanted a way of creating a world in which I could have. Sorry, let me back up a step. One of the things that I like most about monsters is the kind of impossible specificity of the bodies. So it's not just like a thing with another thing. It's half goat, half cheetah, or whatever it might be. The specificity of it. And so for that reason, what I wanted was a mechanism whereby I could create as many specific, particularized, monstrous bodies as possible within a particular universe. And so thinking of a kind of story, a narrative mechanism whereby I could create a literally endless number of composite bodies was a way of having as many monsters as possible. And then there was a political point, which was not a particularly sophisticated political point, which was I was thinking a lot about the kind of increasingly sadistic pathologization of the criminal and the criminal body in particularly American culture, but also bleeding over into British culture and globally and so on. And so there was a fairly kind of direct metaphorization of this idea of, making the criminal an absolute monster and literally, embodying the monsterification of the criminal. So there was a certain sort of very, very, very simple to the point of simplistic politicized outrage at that, but kind of transmogrified into an aesthetic form. At the broader level, and this gets to the kind of, why the interest in the monster at all. You talk about the hybrid bodies. I mean, I think you're quite right. I mean, I've been very interested for a long time in, I started off simply loving monsters, and like a lot of kids, and then becoming kind of post facto interested in why that might be and what that meant and so on. And so trying to work out what kind of ground zero for the monster is, And for me, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the germ seed of the monster is the composite body. The chimera is the sort of the Grundnorm of the monstrous. And then, the other kind of monsters, like things that are too big, things that are too small, things that do these are important parts of the family now. But for me, it's the composite that's the generative monster thing. And I should say, I just very recently read a book, which I mentioned in the lecture I gave last night, in the speech called The Origin of Monsters by David Wengrow, which I think is an absolutely astonishing work of radical archaeology on the kind of on the birth of the composite body as an aesthetic form. So the remades were a way of, at a sort of simple narrative level, having as much joy as I could in terms of the creation of the monster, because monsters are a source of great joy to me and to many others. But this was merely a culmination of a lifetime's fascination with monsters and bestiaries and the taxonomy of the monstrous and so on. And then after that, so I've been very interested and gratified by the fact that some people who are interested, for example, in animal studies have been interested in these terms of the animal-human hybrid and so on, and some sort of scholars of kind of post-humanity and so on. But these are, I mean, I'm very glad of these, and I find them very interesting. But these are, for me, post facto responses, and this is about these things that you put out in the world then becoming owned as much by the recipients as by yourself, I suppose. Does that get to what you're...
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to sort of shift a little bit, because one of the things that I'm really interested in having our conversation center around is just the variety of the kinds of writing that you've done. So I'm going to now move to a 2016 publication, from the beginning of your career to the current moment of it. In The Last Days of New Paris, you have a counterfactual, which was not enough. It has to be a counterfactual also about surrealists, which is an extraordinary, head-spinning, kind of fascinating concept. And one of the things that it made me think of with regard to your earlier novels, which are explicitly about things that either are yet to happen or never could happen, is just sort of where the surreal meets the abreal, kind of in what ways the ways in which you might think through how history didn't go, but perhaps could have or couldn't have, kind of connects with what you've been developing for a while now, which is sort of this other space. To me, that's several questions at once, or several points. I mean, I think The Last Days of New Paris is was an enormous. It's not a word I tend to use about my own stuff, but it was an enormous amount of fun to do, and it's very much a kind of a jeu d'esprit. It's a light, playful book, which was, as I mentioned previously, literally written on the basis of a potential video game that I was developing, and I had this idea for this world, which was partly
partly because I'm interested in video games as a form, although I don't play them because I'm really bad at them, but I'm very interested in them as a form, and partly because I was interested in introducing surrealism. There's an awful lot, I mean, surrealism is a huge influence on a lot of game design, but bringing it like directly in, partly because the surrealists were so interested in play, and partly simply because the images they created were so amazing. So this notion essentially of the world of Paris that has become isn't just surreal, it's literally surrealistized. Within that, then there were several kind of sub-projects, and one of the sub-projects in the book, I mean, it's an odd book in the sense that it's a novella plus a framing narrative plus footnotes, but the footnotes exist within the world of the book, so they're kind of meta footnotes, but they're also accurate in terms of the artistic information that they pertain, which was partly simply a way of saying, here's some really interesting art that if you don't know you might like, and partly was a way of trying to tie that in within a narrative form, sort of retaining fidelity to the book. One of the projects I wanted to do was to have a kind of polemical position on the nature of the Surrealist Canon, because Surrealism is an art form, a movement that is at once, was almost kind of echt radical when it occurred, and then became commodified and banalized at an incredible speed. And the canon of artists that are always recited, Magritte, Dali, and so on, some of them I admire, some of them I don't. I'm not a Dali guy. But this has created a sense of a canon, and there's a kind of alternative surrealist canon. And unsurprisingly, many of these artists are women, many of them are artists of color. I mean, there is a kind of attack on a lot of the surrealists from a kind of radical position, which was that these are essentially sort of bullshit artists talking it big on the left bank and playing around. And there's no question that some of them were, but I think that's very, very unfair about the best of that tradition. And for example, if you look at the very early journals in surrealism, their position on decolonialization, a radical anti-colonial position, was literally decades ahead of most of the left. And we're talking about the most radical people on the left, like literally decades ahead of the left. An unflinching, unremittingly militant anti-colonial position. And some writers and artists featured in the first surrealist journals were writers from Légitime Défense, which was a Martinican radical publication, and then you have the kind of the queer writers and artists of surrealism like Claude Cahun and people like that, and so one of the things I wanted to do was to take the opportunity not to bypass all of the big names. I'm a huge Max Ernst fan, but to sort of but to make my surrealist canon among the more radical, the radical wing of the surrealist canon. So that's the specifics of the surrealism within that book. It's interesting that you make a distinction between the surreal and the abreal, because I think I would too. Surrealism as an influence it's been enormously powerful and important to me for a long time, despite all of its domestication in recent years. But it's something I return to all the time. It was one of the absolute taproots for me, artistically and politically. The prefix ab is something I've been very interested in for a long time, and I sort of slowly was trying to develop a theorization of what it was doing. And to me, ultimately, I was kind of tentatively putting forward a position that it is a way of thinking about something that is distinct from the uncanny. So I make this distinction between the abcanny and the uncanny. The uncanny being the returned repressed, and the abcanny being the eruption of the kind of radical, bad, sublime new. And these, to me, are both sort of different iterations of a kind of an unrealism, a non-realism that I find endlessly fecund and productive, both as a reader and a writer. So I think, for me, all the different specificities, whether it's weird fiction of the 1920s, which I think of as sort of pulp modernism, whether it's the surrealists, whether it's some of the kind of avant-garde writers or linguistic experimentalists, whether it's pulp science fiction, whether it's the new wave science fiction of the 1960s and 70s, these to me are all different moments within a kind of broader aesthetic of the non-real, which I find, to which I always return.
I suspect we're going to have a lot of questions. People are going to want to ask a lot more questions about some of the things we're describing right now. Since we're talking a little bit about prefixes, I think I'll take that as my entryway point to talk about language as well. And Embassy Town, I guess in particular, although the truth is that as I was rereading and preparing for today and thinking about your work, I was struck by how fully fleshed out your interests in language have just kind of run throughout your career. Bellis Coldwine, translators, linguists, mediators of language, diplomats, narrators who kind of do things with words. So I guess I'm sort of, I'm struck by and really interested in and curious to hear about the ways in which Embassy Town specifically is a novel in which language itself is medium, plot, setting, character, aesthetic, and philosophy. Language is front and center sort of in the novel throughout. And at the same time, it's a kind of engagement with philosophies of language. And I guess I'm just interested, and it doesn't have to be Embassy Town, but I'd be really fascinated to hear you talk about just the different ways in which language is a part of that, as you were just describing it, sort of process of engaging the unreal.
Well, I am not a linguist. I'm not either at a scholarly level nor at I'm not a good linguist. I'm in terms of speaking other languages. I am very interested in linguistics and language, but particularly in sociolinguistics. That's been that was kind of my initial interest in language, was through sociolinguistics, but more generally as well. I mean, as from Embassy Town, you can see I got and remain completely fascinated with metaphor and the philosophy of metaphor and writing around metaphor. And I have a kind of long stalled project on a non-fiction book about metaphor, of which Embassy Town is essentially the fictionalized version. So language is something that I'm interested in at, I think, a relatively abstract level. Like, there is a strong tradition, as you know, of like linguistics featuring in science fiction, in fantasy, in the fantastic. And it often manifests, not always, but often manifests in a kind of very close fascination with the specifics of invented languages. So most famously, Tolkien's entire oeuvre, was spun out of his desire to create a language and to create Elvish. I'm actually not very interested in those specifics. When I was writing various of the books, I would try and create words or whatever that were plausible and so on. But I had absolutely no interest in creating a lexicon and so on, as often people do. But I was very interested in the philosophies of the language underpinning it. It's interesting hearing you talk about the various other books and the way language appears in it, because as so often, it's much clearer to me now that you're talking about it than at the time. So you're right. I do talk about language a lot. Embassy Town obviously was very conscious. I mean, Embassy Town is a book in which it's entirely structured around language. Although, as I said to you the other day, to me it's as much about theology as it is about language, and particularly to do with the intersection of the two at a kind of very abstract sort of philosophical, theological level. Early debates, sort of 17th century and earlier debates about the Adamic language and the angelic language and so on, and the nature of combining that with the nature of the fall and the discussion about the fall. So, on one level, excuse me, on one level, interest in language is nothing new in my field, but I am interested in in the philosophy of it, and I'm interested in the way one of the things that fiction does is it allows you to take theories which you know are false, but you can use them for narrative terms as if they weren't. And so, for example, in the case of Embassy Town, although it's not the main organizing principle, there is an inference that you can make that within the context of this particular world, what I'm sure many people here will know, what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is correct, which is essentially about saying that language determines thought and that your thought patterns are, created by your language. And I had some pushback on this from some linguists and anthropologists telling me that, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is wrong. I know the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is wrong. What I thought was that it would make an interesting peg for a story, So you can kind of literalize these thought experiments in a way that I find very powerful and very fecund. And particularly in the case of Embassy Town, my interest was less to do with language tout court than the specifics of metaphor and the specifics of language as theology. Not just language and theology, but language as theology. One coda to that is this is something that happens to me not infrequently and I find quite exciting, which is realizing very, very long after the event that there's been a kind of occult influence that I have forgotten, disavowed, not taken account of. And in the case of this, and in the case of language, it's a book I read many years ago, and it had an immense impact on me. And it's Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban. It's a post-apocalypse book written in, I think, the 70s, possibly the early 80s, by a writer not particularly associated with science fiction, a kind of experimental, high literary writer, American, based in Britain. But the shtick of it is it's a post-apocalypse novel, and it's written in a broken language. It's written in a new language that is the language, essentially the kind of the detritus of language as filtered through apocalypse. And it latterly occurred to me very recently that sense of language as ruin is also very, and indeed salvaging language from that ruin is also something. So I wasn't remotely conscious of that at the time in the way I was about metaphor, for example, but I think it's very current.
So that's so interesting because so much of what you've just said really does put features of Embassy Town into some very sharp relief. So just for those of you who haven't read Embassy Town, this is a science fiction novel. As China has said, it's I think you've called it your first science fiction novel. And it takes place in the distant future. Earth is a kind of lost mythic origin. Humans exist but speak a version of a language called Anglo-Ubic. Is that pronounced properly? And humans are colonizing a planet on which the alien beings, alien to us, not to the planet, the kind of resident beings, can only speak their form of language with a capital L through two mouths and heard from sentient beings. And if it's not spoken through two mouths at one time, which is rendered in the novel through a kind of linguistic fraction, kind of cutting language in half, language doesn't make sense to them, and there's no way for humans to communicate with the Arikai. Is that right?
Arieke, yeah.
Arieke. So ambassadors are required as sort of diplomat translators, and then a near apocalypse ensues. I won't spoil the fun of the narrative. So it's kind of pre-apocalyptic language change.
And again, the seeds of these go back a long way. So Swift's Gulliver's Travels is a very important book to me and has been for a long time. And a lot of these games and ideas are in Swift. So Swift has, both he has because the Arieke can't lie because because their relationship between sign and referent is direct. That's in Swift. There's the Huinhim can't lie, and then I think it's in the island of Laputa. There's a group of people who think it's inefficient to speak because it's using signs instead of directly talking about the thing you want to talk about, so they carry everything they might ever want to say around with them. So there was also there's kind of harking back to that, but not played for satire, but played for kind of apocalypse.
And one of the chief characters, the protagonist of the character of the novel, Avis, is described as becoming a simile in the language in exactly that way. She becomes the thing that's carried along, or she enacts a scene in order to be able to say something that they can't say otherwise.
Yeah, there's a lot of. I hope it's not just hand waving, but there's a certain ellipsis and slipperiness in the book, in the sense that the book, again, without wanting to give too much away, is about a certain kind of passage of signification, and one of the way. I mean, the entire book is predicated on certain impossibilities, and I accept that. But trying to take those impossibilities as if they weren't impossible, and trying to treat them with a kind of glassy-eyed conviction, and what that means is you have to kind of think in terms of kind of tendential logic. So there is a set. So the Ariake, if they want to use similes, they have to enact scenes which they can then describe as a way of comparing other things to them. So they cut a rock in half so that they can then say it's like the rock that was cut in half. Because if there was no rock cut in half, there's nothing to refer to. But that, in its form, implies a thinking beyond the literal. And for me, this is very much to do with the segue between, well, I don't think it's a segue. I think it's a kind of dialectical shift from simile to metaphor. And the more I think about it, and the more I read about it, and the more I sort of circle around it, the more I think metaphor is everything. Metaphor is the key to an awful lot of things.
Part of the plot of this really extraordinary novel too is that metaphor and other figurative language is impossible because it's a lie in a literal sense. And so what's not possible, what's not kind of materially accurate or true, can't be said, but is sort of titillating, is exciting, is kind of a kind of sensate. So there's this prelapsarian kind of mode of language, Edenic, as you were saying, but that is also kind of married to, in a certain sense, early 20th century language philosophy, because if Avis is a simile, it's a little bit like what linguists or language philosophers have said about how we don't speak language, language speaks us. So there is this way. So and then there's the kind of the cut, the fractured language of posts.
A lot of yes, I agree. A lot of the stuff that I try and do is. I have a great deal of fidelity to my own obsessions. The things that have interested me, the things that interest me, have tended to interest me for a long time, and sometimes I add new things to them. But in the case of Embassy Town, this sounds like a kind of cute story made up for marketing. It is 100% true that the first draft of what later became Embassy Town was written when I was 11, and the generative thing was actually the idea of a language that's spoken with two mouths at once. And I have this little document that I wrote, in pencil or whatever, when I was 11, in which there's an alien language rendered with two lines of text over as if a mathematical symbol. And I think partly this is simply a very, very simple, very naive pleasure in text that messes about. From a young age, like I remember being I don't know, at 13, I think, and discovering Tristram Shandy. And, the idea that you have this book written in the 18th century that has text that is the wrong shape and that has black pages and that is aware of the materiality of text on the page. So in a very kind of unembarrassed way, part of it was simply the pleasure of thinking, how can you render something in a book in a way that hasn't been done before, because that's interesting, And then from that, quite often I find some of the most interesting ideas and philosophical ideas and so on follow from just that kind of arresting image, just that hook. So rather than thinking, here's my idea, how do I now render it? Just thinking, that's a cool idea, that's a cool image, what might it mean?
So in a sense, the question I want to ask, but I don't know how to ask, because what you describe and also write is so evocative and also kind of hard to fully grapple with. What does it mean to write a multilingual alien novel? In other words, how do you engage the sort of the communication transfer? When you think about that kind of divisional, fractional language,
Yeah.
and you sort of then think about what the human character in there who can't communicate with those beings, is there a way of communicating that lack of understanding?
Yeah.
Is it sort of like a noisy silence?
I think that's a very good way of putting it. A noisy silence is absolutely right, because I mean the short answer is no. I mean I think one of the kind of interesting paradoxes of science fiction is that it's a genre which is obsessed with the alien, and yet definitionally the alien can't really be depicted. I think that's literally true, and particularly if you're thinking about alien cognition, alien, a genuinely non-human way of thinking. I think it is a simple statement of fact that if you are a human writer, you can't really write in human thought. I think, and this goes back to stuff we were talking about, on the other day about the fascination in the unsayable. This goes to the kind of interest in the kind of ecstatic religious tradition about the unsayable, and the ultimate source of the unsayable, the ultimate source of the unthinkable, the beyond language, is God stroke the real stroke the sublime, and that I think is the kind of telos of all these discussions. The interesting thing about science fiction as a genre is that it both knows this and disavows it endlessly with various degrees of elan and sort of swagger and enjoyability. So the great majority of aliens in science fiction are what I think of as Star Trek aliens, which are just humans with rubber bumps, and I mean that at a cognitive level. I mean their cognitive processes are simply ours, plus the phrase on our world we ... But it's essentially human, and this is not a diss. I mean, because that's fine. That's fine. You can tell a story that way. There's no problem with that. The other option, and it's something that I, again, latterly realized I've been trying to do since at least Perdita Street Station with The Weaver, which is to think genuinely and with some degree of seriousness about an absolutely inhuman cognition, the unsayable, the beyond words. And you definitionally can't do it. And so all the other tradition of fantastic fiction, which tries to sort of take it really seriously and actually meet that challenge head on, is always already going to fail. Always. It will fail. It can't not fail. So the best it can do is think of strategies for better failure. And there's the Beckett quote, which we all trot out all the time about failing better. But it's not just about trying and failing better. It's about strategizing preemptively for your inevitable failure. And I think a lot of my attempt to think these unthinkables, whether it's in theory, in nonfiction, or whether it's in fiction, is to try and be as rigorous as possible about my strategy for inevitable failure, and to make it as fecund and interesting a failure as possible.
I suspect I speak for more than myself when I say that if any of us failed like that, we would be very happy with our failures. So I'm going to encourage people to start thinking about questions, because I'm going to ask one more question now, but I'm going to shift towards engaging the audience and letting the audience have a chance to ask you some questions. So I'll just ask a question about time, about the impossibly far future and the distant past, and the ways in which play with time kind of factors into the fantasy and the fantastic for you. Sorry, no segue.
Well, there is. I mean, time is unthinkable, and that's not a new revelation. I suppose the go-to figure for me here immediately is Ballard, and J.G. Ballard's work, which is obsessed with what he called deep time, which is essentially a scale of time, whether it's past, future, or more particularly in the Ballardian sense, the experiential, the way time is actually inhabited, which is radically ahuman, often generally at a kind of unthinkable, stretched out slowness, but not necessarily. And I suppose I don't have much that's kind of very insightful to, I don't think, to say about this, except to the extent that Ballard's fascination with deep time, I found one of the many things about Ballard, for all his problems and for all my kind of bewitched wrestling with him, I found profoundly kind of moving, was this sort of radical anti-humanism around time. What's interesting is recently there's been, I mean, it's not something that's new, but there's recently been a great deal of theoretical interest in this, and people who are interested in philosophy probably know the work of the speculative realists, which became a very, very trendy philosophical moment recently, and the French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux, who has this notion of the archifossil, and the archifossil being a thing which is a trace of some. He essentially is thinking deep time backwards. The idea of a trace which is so radically pre-existing any human subjectivity that it radically problematizes that subjectivity at all. And one of the things that's interesting for me is the way that's a way of thinking about, this is a problematic that's been in the most interesting fantastic fiction for a long time. A lot of Lovecraft's work, the way he talks about his own monsters. He has this phrase in The Call of Cthulhu where he says that Cthulhu had been waiting for vigintillions of years. And it's this sense of Cthulhu as the living archifossil. So I suppose on one level, all I can say is I definitely consider myself part of that tradition of thinking about time as a sort of deprivileging human subjectivity. Unlike Ballard, I mean, Ballard has a kind of austere, his lack of interest in actually existing humans is sometimes quite remarkable, and I think makes for very brilliant and amazing fiction. But I don't think I'm that. So I suppose maybe one of the things I'm interested in doing, again, particularly probably in Embassy Town, is an impossible and always going to fail attempt to marry a kind of politicized humanism with the anti-humanism, an ontological anti-humanism.
I think this might be a good moment to open up the floor to questions about some of China's novels, writings. Please.
I was curious which world's rules and laws were more challenging to write within, Embassy Towns or City in the Cities?
Can people at the back hear the question? Okay, the question was it harder to write? Did you say laws?
Like, just work within
Right.
the framework of the world that you created.
Whether it was harder to work within the framework of the City in the City or Embassy Town. Harder is a very interesting question. I'm going to duck it and say that they were differently hard and differently easy. I mean, the City in the City had much more intimacy, and it didn't have that kind of sense of kind of austere, deep time and sort of that kind of thread of anti-humanism. The City in the City is a much more, it's much more up close, I think, than Embassy Town. So that, I suppose, on one level that made it, the particular hardness of that is that I'm trying to depict a situation which, for those who haven't read it, is essentially two cities that exist in the same space. It makes sense in the context of the book, I can't, which is impossible, but I needed it to be taken for granted by the characters and introduced to the reader in such a way that the reader simultaneously understood that this is impossible, but also just goes with it according to a social logic. That was very important to me, that this is a social logic. This is not an impossible social logic. It's a merely extrapolated, exaggerated social logic. So that was difficult in the sense that I was depicting something that was simultaneously absurd and also completely everyday. So I was concerned to get that right. So that was a much more kind of proximate difficulty. The difficulty, I suppose, with Embassy Town was that the kinds of impossibilities I was dealing with were much more abstract. The representation of language is predicated on a set of impossibilities. The representation of the alien the inhuman, of the beyond words, is impossible. And that's at a much more kind of, as I say, austere, abstract level. And so to do that, and to have a viewpoint character who is estranged from herself in certain ways, and who is disingenuous to us and to herself about her own relation to the things around her, and yet to make us care about her enough to want to keep reading and to feel that she's an actual agent in this situation. That was the difficulty there. I didn't have a sense of like one of them was harder than the other. That just wasn't how it was experienced. But they did feel, it's funny now that you put them together like that, because I think of them very much together. Although they're unrelated, they weren't thought of as a series. And in certain senses, I wonder whether I could think of them as antipodes. I don't know. But I often end up lumping them together. And also they're often, if people like one, they often like the other. And there's people who never read science fiction who don't have any interest in reading Perdido Station or whatever, but they will read Embassy Town and they will read The City and the City. So there's clearly some relation between those two books, but I don't quite know what it is.
You want to call on people?
I have really bad eyesight. It would be easier if you did it. Sorry, if you don't mind.
Okay, why don't we just go around the room this way?
Thanks for a great conversation. We chatted a bit yesterday about anthropology, and as an anthropologist, we're always eager to explain you. So probably be on our website tomorrow, under a kind of major anthropology becomes a world famous author. But more seriously, you talked about theology and art and literature, particularly as things that have shaped your writing. I'm wondering how, if any, your undergraduate degree in education shaped what you do, and are there particular places that inspired you for their oddities or particular anthropological general ideas that you incorporate into your work beyond your work?
So the question is about anthropology. My first degree was in anthropology. And the question is about the impact of that on the fiction and so on. The easier part of that question is about other interesting places. And I mean I've lived or visited various. It tends to be large cities that have interested me. So I've spent some time in Havana and in Cairo and in various cities in the U.S. And Harare in Zimbabwe, and I'm interested. So that sense of the kind of variety of cityness and the extent to which there is, despite that variety, some kind of shared essence, if indeed there is. But that problematic is something that's been very interesting and so on. In terms of anthropology as a discipline, I originally went to university to read English because in the UK we don't decide our major later. We go to university to read a subject, and I was admitted to university to read English literature. And after a term, I switched to anthropology, and I'm very glad I did. And that's not a diss on English literature, incidentally.
Don't listen to that part.
Some of my best friends, as they say. But well, there were several reasons. One of the things I owe to anthropology is a kind of tremendous kind of open-mindedness to theory and critical theory, because in English, when I was studying it and where I was studying it, which is an important provisos, there were people who were very, very interested in kind of critical theory and so on as a way of studying literature. But it was also possible to do a literature degree without touching any of that, and to essentially do a kind of, unself-critical kind of new criticism style. You could do that. You couldn't do that in anthropology. If you studied anthropology, you were axiomatically, where I was, thinking about the theories of the way you were looking about the world. We had courses on theory. So there was that. There was, I think this is something I came to realize. I mean, there's the obvious stuff, which is, the wonderful variety of the human animal, and its culture. I mean, and I don't mean to be flip about that. It's true. I'm very interested in cultural difference, and the specificities of culture. I'm very interested in certain, in myths and so on. So those particularities are interesting. But at a more overarching level, I think one of the things, and it took me many years to begin to clock this, one of the things that I took from anthropology, and I don't think this is particular to anthropology, I think I could have got it from other venues as well, from other approaches, was totality. And a sense of social totality. There are plenty of anthropologists who don't take that, who are indeed relativists. This is one of the big arguments in anthropology. And it was an argument that obsessed me about cultural relativism versus some kind of overarching theory. And I have and to me, it was both politicizing and theoretically kind of consolidating and generative of a kind of rigor to recognize the indispensability of totality as a concept for me. And most of the theorists whose work has been very important to me have had a sense of totality. And for me, it's something I come back to a lot. The sense of everything being connected with everything else. And the sense that there is a way out there of connecting and thinking that, the exchange rates between the French franc and the US dollar in 1974, women's oppression, the Attica prison uprising, and Mickey Mouse are connected. And that was something that I got out of anthropology. Whether anthropology intended me to get that out of it, I don't know.
This is a question that occurred to me as you were responding to Josh's last question. I think it was at least, and you were reflecting on the complexities, the difficulties of constructing an impossible world in such a way that the reader can accept the social logic and go with the flow and enjoy it. So this has a political pivot to it. So I'm wondering is it feasible to imagine a socialist world in that kind of way? Because obviously there are some classic socialist utopias, and there are some very unconvincing ones and some very daft ones. So, but is it possible to do that in a way that's not just plausible, good propaganda, but complex and enjoyable and challenging in all the ways that you want your fiction and we want your fiction to be? Have you thought of doing that? And if not, why not?
Did you get that at the back? To do the depiction of socialism, essentially, to the depiction of a post-capitalist world. Is that a fair? Okay. Well, my go-to answer here is no, I don't think it is. And that is not only is that radically different for me from saying it's impossible that could be created, it is constitutive of believing that it could be created. It is, to me, I think, I am not a person of faith, but I think it is, I don't take it as a criticism to say at all. I take it as diagnostic to say that for me, because I am a socialist. I am someone committed to a post-capitalist social world, and my relationship to socialism is, and this is by no means unique to me, is eschatological. It is part of that kind of millenarian tradition. This is a connection which has been made many times. But I take it very seriously, very kind of constitutively seriously. It's not just a question of saying, one wants a better world, one wants the big rock candy mountain, although I do not in any sense denigrate the desire for the big rock candy mountain. I'm quite serious. I mean, I think those kind of dream utopias are quite important in many cases because of their absurdity. But in this particular question, it is, if this goes back to totality, for me, and this is where there is an absolutely rational kernel to the connection between the sort of Chiliastic tradition and the Marxist tradition, is that if you take seriously social totality, one of those components, along with Mickey Mouse and the exchange rates, is the human mind. You know, that doesn't mean that we are robots programmed by, you know, an oppressive totality, but it does mean we are absolutely conditioned by that totality and that we can't think outside it, which for me is one of the reasons that politics often, I don't mean this in a sectarian fashion, a certain type of anarchist politics, a certain type of ultra-left politics, a certain type of hippie politics, which is predicated on prefiguration, is a category error for me. And it is to both honor the totality of capitalism and to take seriously the radicalism of the potential of an alternative, to say that we can't think beyond it. It is in the process of changing it that one might change oneself and start to become someone capable of thinking beyond this shit. And so for that reason, no, I think any depiction of a post-capitalist totality will always banalize, domesticate, fail, be unrealistic, be polemical, not polemical, sorry, be sort of trite, or be dull, you know, because it can only ever be a preemptively hobbled dream predicated on the now, on what Trotsky calls the social lie. And in a post-lie world, we won't, you know, we won't be these people, so we will be dreaming different dreams and dreaming them in a different way. So it is precisely about the importance of getting there that is why I think, I mean, people often refer to Marx's reference about not writing the recipe books for the cooks of the future. This is why he refused to describe socialism. It's a little, you know, bagatelle, it's a little bon mot, but I think there's a very important truth to it. And that is why I won't go into the specifics because it would comprise spoilers, but that is precise. You have basically just got at the key point, the nexus of Iron Council. So no, I think this is undepictable and unthinkable.
So I was really interested in when you said that your latest novel was the most fun, or at least was one of the few novels that was fun. Because I was kind of curious about, if I can turn to Unlondon, I don't know, you said some novels, Josh, so I don't know if okay, I can go away on you. But I was kind of curious about that process of writing YA for you, particularly since it's not the only type of writing that you do, and what the process was like, and was it fun? In the most basic question, but also, what did it mean to, and if this is even a thing, what did it mean to write for a specific age group? Obviously, your text is very much invested in really the canon of children's and young adult literature, and sort of subverting much of it in a way that I adore. But how was that process, and what did you feel constrained? Did you feel like there were certain things that you had or could not do specifically aimed at sort of adolescent or child? Or was that even a part of your process?
So this is a question about the specifics of the pleasures of writing YA broadly, young adult fiction, children's fiction. You're right, actually, that there was a more kind of relaxed fun to writing the two books for younger readers, Unlondon and Railsea, than some of the books for adults. And I think that that's partly, as I was saying if there's people who were at the class from this morning, I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat myself, that's partly because within fiction for younger readers, particularly quite much younger readers, you have, I think, room to be broader. And so there's just a pleasure in being broad in the same way as there's a pleasure in slapstick, you know. So there was an element of that. There's also just straightforwardly an element of play. Obviously all the books are play to some extent, but there's much more self-consciously in the younger books, there's a sense of play. So I think that's very true. And I was aware of it feeling lighter. I've been wrestling with a formulation for this because, as you know, doubtless know, Graham Greene used to describe, he used to distinguish between his novels and his entertainments. And some of his books he called entertainments, and some of them he called novels. And then in his later life, he rode back from that. And the thing is with that, it's really interesting, but there's a great problem to it, which is that it's sort of preemptively an apology. It's in some sense kind of denigratory of the entertainments, and that's it's a categorical mistake. You know, when you think about something like Brighton Rock, which he called an entertainment, and it's like this searing moral tract about, you know, the great questions. So partly it's just categorically, taxonomically, it's questionable. Secondly, I think, you know, I struggle with this though, because I think there is a there to that, but his formulation is unconvincing, is not helpful. And so I've been struggling to think of a way of expressing this. And what I've kind of tentatively come up with is breathing in and breathing out. And there are the books that feel kind of wrenched out, that are very difficult, that are often quite, I mean, it sounds really melodramatic. It's not like being beaten up. It's not like, you know, abuse, but that feel quite traumatic to write, that come from deep. And, you know, the Iron Council and This Census Taker. And those are the books that mean the most to me. You know, those are the books that come from deepest. And that's breathing in. That's like and then there's the exhalation. And there are the books that are breathing out. And they're much more playful. They're much lighter. There's a sense of kind of the shoulders relaxing. And that would be the books for the younger readers. And also, in an unusual way, I mean, The Last Days of New Paris is a breathing out. Carla Mallet, who is here, described New Paris as, and I believe her when she assured me it wasn't a criticism, I really do, described it as an adolescent book. And I really like that, because that's how it felt. And I think that's partly because of its derivation from video games. It's a book that was written as a video game. It's, you know, so that the relationship to play and a kind of youthful play is much more direct. And so I think that the fun, you use the word fun, is a product of that. The books that mean the most to me, the books that, to repeat the formulation I said to you yesterday, the books that I would want in my coffin if I could only have 3, are not the fun books. But that doesn't mean I don't love the fun books, and it doesn't mean I don't love having fun when I'm doing them. But it's breathing out, and it's the breathing in that takes the effort, and both for me and I think for the reader. Does that make sense at all? Yeah.
Do you want to say what the third book is?
I think at the moment the third book is Embassy Town. Embassy Town and City in the City one of those tends to be the third book.
So we've run...
No, City in the City. I don't know. No, I think it's Embassy Town today. I think it's Embassy Town.
We're essentially out of time, and we'll have opportunities to see China upstairs, where he's going to do a reading. If we want to do one last question, really fast.
Try and be quick.
Yeah, we can do it, please.
Any thoughts on how the Brexit might impact your work or other artists and writers?
In
6 words or fewer.
Can I take 2 minutes? Are we going to be okay?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, are we going to get kicked out of here? I'm not going to be long, but I can't do that in 6 words. Okay. Brexit is, as you clearly know, Brexit is massive. You know, it's a huge, huge shift. And I think it's important to be clear about the nature of what's been going on here, because there has been an enormous kind of lachrymose outpouring, because Brexit has unleashed hideous social logics, racist attacks, a kind of previously disavowed sort of furious dog nationalism, which has been incredibly ugly to witness. So it's completely understandable to me that people are terrified by this, and I share that. The day after Brexit felt horrifying, but there is a problem, which is that a lot of the Europhilia is predicated on completely false premises and is smug and unhelpful. So, you know, for one thing, like, you know, the kind of outpouring of grief, the endless opinion pieces written to, I am going to answer your question, but I can't not do this as a setup. So the endless opinion pieces going, you know, written to the citizens of Europe, you know, we are still with you, we are so sorry this has happened, and so on, frankly provoked in me 8 times out of 10 bile. Because it's like, if you have not been writing these opinion pieces about the desolation of deindustrialized communities, the growth of racism in, in various places in Britain, the sadistic class spite unleashed by the Conservatives against the British working class, the desolation and the decimation of these. If you have been quiet about this and now you are banging the fuck on about brioche, I don't want to hear it. There were good reasons to be against the EU. The Brexit vote came out in the immediate aftermath of the destruction of Greece, the destruction of the Syriza government. I mean, the Syriza capitulated, but the neoliberal assault on Greece, of which the EU was not just merely part, it was literally one of the 3 pillars. It was one of the key mechanisms for unleashing predatory neoliberalism. And the death rate that has gone up in Greece. The EU is saturated with blood on its hands. The EU is currently building Fortress Europe at its own edges. The EU is as much of a wall fetishist as Donald Trump, okay? So, the problem with Brexit was that there was no way out. There was no good option. You were either being asked to vote in favor of neoliberal butchers, or you were being asked to vote in favor of a racist spite reaction. There are many people who voted for Brexit who have absolutely legitimate social concerns. This is an effort, but it has taken a racialized and kind of reactive form out of rage and fury. I mean, I'm not excusing it, because there's also a great deal of invested racism in that. But one has to be careful about picking that apart. So in terms of, the reason that's important is in terms of responding to Brexit, the lachrymose Europhilia will not do. Okay, so, and this is where one of the few good things to have happened in Britain in the last decades is what's been going on in the Labour Party, and the fact that we now have a genuinely radical leader who's very embattled, but who is precisely trying to effect a different kind of Brexit, a Brexit that is not racialized, that is anti-racist. Whether this is possible, whether this is feasible, is a separate question. But there is an attempt to do that, and there is an attempt to kind of pull back on that. Now, the short answer is yes. I think it is going to have an immense effect on the work, on my stuff, and on the stuff of writers and artists and so on. I have become very conscious of the fact that various of my own work in the last few years is totally imbricated in austerity. There's a particular story that I wrote called Estate, which I realized after the fact is an austerity story. I wasn't aware of it at the time. And I am 100% convinced that we are going to see a wave of Brexit angst, Brexit unconscious. The Brexit unconscious is going to start iterating in fiction. Yes. The question of whether that is an articulation of despair, whether it is an articulation of sadistic social spite, or whether it is an articulation of a superpositional possibility between the two, depends entirely on what happens politically in the next 2 years. I don't think the situation is good. I don't quite think it's hopeless. 18 months ago, I thought it was hopeless. Now I don't quite, and I'm surprised to hear myself say that.
So on that note...